So we're lucky today for the last talk to have Graeme Hawker. So from the University of Strathclyde, Graeme is a research fellow in future energy systems, and he works as part of the UK Energy Research Centre, where he is deputy director of the theme on infrastructure transitions. He's a graduate of both Cambridge and Glasgow universities, and prior to academia, he worked in the Scottish wind industry, integrating new wind farms into the national grid balancing mechanism. And he has also recently worked at the Scottish Government, assessing the future of the Scottish gas network and the potential hydrogen transition. Graeme's going to talk for like 30 to 40 minutes. So we'll have time for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, you can do it in the chat or use the hands up function. So I think, Graeme, if you'd like to proceed.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David, and to Matthew for the invitation to speak today. If you just give me a second to make my slides work. So good morning from my kitchen cupboard, repurposed into an office, to various spare bedrooms, kitchens, and so forth around the country. And hopefully this will now. Okay, can you see that fine? Okay.
Yeah, it's all okay.
So as David said, I've been working with the UK Energy Research Centre for about 6 years now, looking at multi-vector problems, multi-carrier energy models, particularly in the space of heat decarbonisation, but ongoing, more looking now at energy system resilience. So some of the issues that might come up in the future around how dependent we are on integration of the electricity and gas grids, for example. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research we've done there as examples of what we see now as some of the problems and issues that we have in trying to do this kind of modelling. And I've credited here my effective boss, Professor Keith Bell, who's also part of the UK Energy Research Centre. And this is partially based on a tutorial that we gave to the Power Systems Computation Conference earlier this summer. So I just wanted to make sure he's credited with some of the material. When I was thinking about putting this together, the current state of things is that we're seeing terms like whole energy systems, energy system integration, whole energy models kind of had a big upsurge recently in the modeling space. So we're seeing that more and more projects, more and more bids are requiring these terms put in, but this isn't necessarily a new area of research. And I was trying to think, what's the oldest example of a multi-energy system that I could come across? And if anyone has any other ideas, think about this and put them in chat while I'm talking. But the oldest kind of system I could find that might fit our modern definition of multi-energy system was on the left here. So 1893, Hamburg City Hall was the first location to have a purpose-built combined heat and power system retrofitted onto a nearby electricity power station. So essentially, people have been doing these things, trying to couple different vectors together for something like 120 years now. If there are older examples than this that people can think of, perhaps from examples that precede electricity, then I'd be interested to hear about them. But this isn't a new issue. And this picture on the right, I put in because about a century after the Hamburg City Hall, my very first job as a teenager on work experience was on this wind farm, Windy Standard, so the first wind farm in Scotland, where I spent some days in the summer hammering pegs into the ground to indicate where that access road that you can see should be following the road. So basically making sure that this road wasn't going to go through any peat bogs. So what does that got to do with multi-energy systems? Well, it was interesting being in the early part of the wind industry in the UK, because in the 90s and 2000s, when wind was first really getting going on a commercial basis, the network constraints basically came in straight away. Network companies didn't really know how to deal with all this new wind capacity. There wasn't really established ways of doing it. And even in the very early days of wind, there was a huge lead time for getting a firm network connection. So projects that were being developed in the early 2000s were looking at 15, 20 years to have to wait for a firm connection agreement. And at the time, these projects were being developed by lots of small independent companies. The utilities hadn't really got much in-house capability yet. So these small developers were trying to find ways to shortcut that lack of network capacity. And there was a lot of interest in new and different ways of getting that wind energy used in the system. So at the time, we had like developers talking about trying to import new flow battery technology, trying to set up local heat networks in rural areas, trying to find perhaps charging stations for EVs, basically ways they could find to create business cases for using energy from wind farms that wouldn't mean having to wait for network capacity to be built. A short time later, Ofgem then introduced Connect and Manage, which basically solved the whole problem and meant that wind farms could connect to the electricity network, and basically that whole thing went away and nothing came of it. So I'm not at all saying that Connect and Manage was a bad policy. It was a great policy. It got us to where we are today with very low emissions on the electricity grid. But I feel there was something of a wasted opportunity perhaps 15, 20 years ago, where people were really talking about multiple vectors, multiple ways of getting energy from renewables into alternative forms of demand and energy services that kind of went off the map as we basically looked to just basically combine everything into the electricity system alone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the current need that we have for this multi-energy modeling, why we have a resurgence of it just at the moment, look a little bit at existing modeling methods and how we can adapt them and use them to meet this problem, and then conclude with a little bit of discussion of some things I see as good practice in what we're doing, having been involved in this myself for a few years now. So the challenge we have is to build and operate a low emissions energy system. We have decarbonisation of the electricity supply, so growing and very large amounts of renewables. We have potentially negative emissions technologies in the electricity sector, so CCS, biomass. We have a potentially unknown feature of the gas system, so the transition to hydrogen is not guaranteed, but we're looking more and more likely to have something going along on that scale, but we don't know how big this is going to be. Is it going to be a wholesale transformation of the gas system, or just localized small areas of the network repurposed? We have existing fossil fuel demands, such as transport and heat, that need to be moved across to other vectors with lower emissions, so perhaps electrification or low carbon gases. But we need to do all of this within deregulated industry. So we need to use markets, we need to have financial models and coherent operational systems that actually work and deliver these projects with the appropriate levels of risk. And we have a huge amount of spatial variance to have to deal with, which means there's not really any particular clear answer to all of these problems. And I work within an electrical engineering department, but it's always useful just to point out our old friend, the Sankey diagram, that electricity is only one very small part of the entire energy picture. There's a huge amount of energy flows, and even if we compare 2012 to 2018, the magnitude of some of these flows has changed significantly. Primarily here, the shift away from coal, but also just the essential nature of energy demand is changing. So if you compare these two flows, we can see that it's basically a very dynamic system that we have to deal with that's undergoing change already. But we can look at the entire system, we can look at all the different vectors that are available to us. We've also got net zero to deal with now. So this incredibly drastic change in ambition, where we've gone from an 80% emissions reduction to 100% emissions reduction. But what that entails is way more than that 20% would suggest. So we can no longer just focus on the easy stuff. We have to do everything. We have sectors that can't decarbonize fully in time for 2050, such as aviation, or sectors which can't decarbonize at all, like agriculture, which will need to be balanced by negative emissions. So this implicitly gives us the need to trade off between different sectors to understand what the options are and which one might be favorable to use. I've put in this graph on the right from a recent paper that we did in UKERC, which talks about heat decarbonisation in particular. So we can see on the right here that in 2050, if we're looking at different levels of greenhouse gas reduction, 80%, 85%, up to 100%, this has very significant changes in the impact on different sectors. So the residential sector in green, and the 80% emissions scenario really doesn't reduce that much compared to what we have today, but at the 100% scenario, it basically disappears. So there are particular sectors that the movement from 80% to net zero is actually equivalent to a complete order of magnitude change in the decarbonisation that's required. But this is not to say that everything is extremely complex. So we don't need to necessarily do lots and lots of complex modelling to try and understand these issues. So one example I like to look at, so we always have the age-old argument of heat decarbonisation, electrification versus alternative gases. And one way we can look at this is to say, okay, we have a gas system that might in future be hydrogen rather than natural gas. And we have a load of condensing gas boilers in people's homes that can then meet their heat demand. Alternatively, we could burn that gas in gas turbines to produce electricity and put that into standard resistive electrical heating. Or alternatively, put that electricity through a heat pump to meet that heat demand. And if we put some outline numbers on this of what the efficiencies might be of each step, we get something like a 85–90% on a good modern gas boiler. CCGT will be somewhere around 6% depending on exactly which turbine technology we're talking about. But the key thing here is that you get this huge gain when you use a heat pump. The specific number will vary, but you could be talking about multiplying by 2 or 3 times the output you get compared to the input. And this makes a fairly strong basic thermodynamic case for using heat pumps over other technologies. If we look to a future system with huge amounts of renewables, the way we're trying to make the best use of that, then we have essentially the 2 alternatives of putting that through a heat pump or electrolyzing renewables into hydrogen perhaps. And if we just take this at a very high level, it seems pretty obvious that putting that renewable electricity through a heat pump to meet heat demand is way better than electrolyzing it, losing potential energy, and then lose even more as we burn it through a gas boiler by several times better just in terms of thermodynamics. So we don't need a complex energy system model to tell us this. It's pretty obvious that putting electricity from renewables through heat pumps is the best thing to do. So the question is not which things should we try and do. The question is, why can't we do this? What are the things that prevent us from just putting heat pumps into every house in the country and running that system? And so these problems are, for example, that we have huge amounts of variability in renewables, they aren't dispatchable, and that means there is a misstep between renewable production and heat demand. So this means that the actual system is going to have problems in trying to balance these 2 parts of the system. The network that's going to be required to supply all this is perhaps not in place and difficult and expensive to build. And there may be social issues. So how do you actually get people persuaded to put heat pumps into their homes? So in this case, we're not needing modeling to tell us what we should do. We're needing modeling to tell us what the constraints are on trying to do what seems like the obvious solution. And that might push us towards a system that then instead looks towards the alternative, lower thermodynamic, but perhaps better in terms of how we might actually use existing networks and get things changed in actual end consumers. If we take that kind of heat pump case, so I'm doing my compulsory part here of using charts by Grant Wilson. There's got to be some in every presentation on multi-energy systems at some point. If we look at the Scottish demands for electricity and gas, if we say that half of that gas demand was converted to heat pumps with a generous coefficient of performance of 3, we're then looking at a peak electricity demand around 50% bigger than what we have at the moment, and a much bigger interannual variation of electricity. So we're looking at input by extending that thermodynamic case. We're saying that suddenly we're looking at a very different electricity system with a lot more investment and flexibility that's going to be required. And if we look at recent historical data with the base of the renewables that we have, we can already see events on the system where we're starting to get into situations where perhaps the overall balance is okay, but the need for flexibility is becoming huge. So the scale of this, where we're talking like something like 20 gigawatts of flexibility over the space of perhaps 4 to 5 hours, which is a huge amount, a huge demand to be placing onto our grid, and that's only going to become stronger and stronger in the future. So is that provided just from traditional thermal plant that can be flexible, or are there other sources of flexibility that we might need to use as this line gets steeper and steeper as we get more and more renewables onto the system? And again, this pushes us away from the simplistic view that electrification is the straightforward and obvious answer. It becomes more of the evidence of why we need a more diverse system that can accept some of this flexibility. And it's not only about networks, we're also getting to the point where just looking fundamentally at the system balance, we're going to start having problems. Well, perhaps silver lining is the wrong word, but one interesting thing that has come out of the coronavirus situation is it's actually given us a very good view of what the future system is going to look like, because the first lockdown actually emulated essentially the electricity system of 10 years' time in some ways. So this is some data that I put together back in the summer looking at demand for electricity in the first lockdown period. So we can see on this is transmission level demand for electricity, and blue lines are just prior to the first lockdown. I think the light blue cyan line is when lockdown started, and then the red and oranges are the weeks that came just after it. So you can see this big change in electricity demand that happened as a result of people basically staying at home, not going to work. And this is, although we do have periods of low demand on the system, they're not normally during the working day, during the working week. And at the same time, we have large amounts of embedded wind, we have large amounts of solar also on the system, which aren't dispatchable. And if we reconstitute what the actual gross demand was, so this is transmission demand, down here is actually reconstituting what we think the kind of raw demand was. We had during the kind of first lockdown, we had gross demand down at around 26 gigawatts. And at the same time, we have something like 7 gigawatts of mostly not very dispatchable wind capacity on the distribution networks. We have around 13 gigawatts of completely non-dispatchable solar capacity on the network. So you add that up and you're getting towards 20 gigawatts already of potentially non-dispatchable renewables. And we have around 8 to 10 gigawatts of nuclear power on the system, which doesn't like having its output changed either. So this year, we were already looking at a situation where just the fundamental balance of the system was putting things under great stress. Demand was too low, essentially, for the inflexible components that we have on the system. And actions were taken, so National Grid contracted with some of the nuclear power plants to turn their output down. But this gives us a good insight as to the situation we'll be in the future, where potentially these solar and wind numbers get higher and higher and higher, rather than demand getting lower. And so we've faced some of these problems already. So what use do we have for doing this kind of multi-energy modeling that might help us to solve some of these problems? And this is essentially helping us to plan and operate the whole system, consider end user requirements for energy, what options actually people have in using energy and how they will choose it. So there's an interesting pilot just begun in Fife that's just been given its network innovation funding, where consumers will be given the choice between using local natural gas to heat their homes or a new hydrogen system that will be built in parallel. And perhaps by looking at things in districts, we can start to look at more aggregated views on meeting end supply. Do we supply end users with electricity and hydrogen, or do we supply them with services? Do we supply them with heat rather than the actual gas that they use to create their own heat? And so these kind of questions of how these different vectors and interactions can be optimized is the space that we're interested in looking at for energy system modeling. And importantly, considering a future scenario where perhaps on the resource and supply side, we're concerned with high capex but low opex technologies, so such as renewables, where essentially the marginal cost is almost or effectively zero. So broadly, when we're talking about energy system models, we're talking about two different areas of research. So there's a multi-vector, multi-carrier energy system model, which is what I'll mainly talk about. Energy supplied, consumed, and transported across multiple vectors, such as looking at joint optimal dispatch of two different vectors. But there's also the kind of long existing field of whole system energy analysis, where you try and characterize the entire flows of energy across a system. So the kind of models like UK Times, where you're trying to capture every element of the energy system and do some kind of optimization to determine what those trade-offs between different sectors might be. So we can go back even further. We can say, but what is a model fundamentally? So we're trying to represent how a system behaves. We have a set of parameters. We have a set of equations that relate system states to independent states and parameters. And so, for example, for electricity, we're looking at defining vector of system parameters. We're looking at independent variables and controls, looking at dependent variables and states through equalities and inequalities. And this gives us a problem that we can try and solve. But important to understand that a model is both a particular combination of the data, the parameters that we put into that model, and the actual method, the algorithm and equations. And I think this gets sometimes a little bit confused when people talk about models, whether they're talking about one or other of those. So for example, there is a times modeling framework, which is a model in terms of being a system of equations that can be solved. And then there is, for example, the UK times model, which is a particular parameterization of that framework for the UK system. So again, I come from electrical system background, and I'm used to these kind of problems where we're taking perhaps a simple electricity system with generation and demand and trying to solve it. So we might be applying constraints that are perhaps representing Kirchhoff's laws and electrical losses. If we're doing an optimal power flow, we might apply additional constraints around generator dispatch. If we were doing a gas flow on a system, then we might have similar constraints that represent the mass flow laws. And instead of electrical losses, we're looking at leakage and thermodynamic losses. And we might be doing some kind of optimization that's based on constraints around the inflows to that system, the line pack that we have to maintain. So essentially, we get into the interesting space of multi-engine analysis when we have some kind of coupling between these two systems. So either we have conversion technologies at particular nodes of the system, or we're allowing demands to be served by multiple carriers through hybrid technologies. And so, for example, a bit of work that we did looking at hybrid systems and how behind network constraints in existing parts of the network in the UK, we could evaluate the extent to which heat pumps could be utilized given a known constraint, and how much reliance there would still be on the existing gas system. So in this example, least emissions dispatch of gas hybrid heat pumps under low voltage network constraints, showing that actually you can get a very high capacity utilization of those heat pumps and a relatively low utilization of existing gas boilers, but the actual capacity of the gas boilers still needs to be quite high to infill those peak periods of heat demand. And one of the kind of common methodologies for looking at this space, and this is what we used here, is the kind of energy hub model, where you combine these systems of equations for different vectors into particular nodal locations. So perhaps a 3-carrier energy node here with electricity, gas, and heat, representing how you can store, convert, produce, and consume each of those within a particular node, and perhaps extending out from single nodes into multiple nodes to build up a view of a local system. And this again builds up this system of equations, a particular parameterization of those equations that you can then solve to determine optimal flows or optimal investment in different technologies. And again, if you're familiar with the electricity system and using Kirchhoff's laws, there are analogous systems that you can use for those other vectors. So for gas network, you can use mass flow law, and for heat network, you can do thermodynamic coupling. So even if you're already familiar with one of these systems, essentially you can use very similar sets of equations to represent all of these. The obvious problem that this creates is things get very complicated very quickly. So if we start to build up an energy system model, we are starting to look about multiple vectors. We start to build up a very detailed picture of spatial resolution. The temporal resolution is important because we're perhaps looking at issues around system flexibility. If we're introducing other concepts around techno-economic detail, so perhaps putting in constraints around unit commitment, and then let's say across multiple sectors, then we get into very high dimensional models very, very quickly that can become very intractable. And this isn't just an issue in terms of computation. We can just throw more processing power at the problem if we need to. It's also a problem because it can make the output of modeling more and more complex to interpret. You don't know whether what you're seeing as a result is an actual inherent outcome of the system or just an outcome of the complexity of the modeling. So I would kind of warn against getting into these very high complexity, high resolution, high temporal and spatial models, unless there is actually a very clear need and benefit from doing so. And it seems there's a lot of people in a lot of research departments just trying to make more and more complex models just for the sake of it, rather than considering whether it directly answers specific questions. Because as I said, referring back to the kind of thermodynamic heat pump case, you don't necessarily need a complex representation to get at some of the key issues. So this kind of balancing complexity is an important thing that we need to deal with when we're doing this kind of modeling. There are various techniques we can use to reduce some of this complexity. So various time-based methods that we can use to kind of mask or downsample and look at representative periods. We can reduce spatial complexity. So these big whole system models that seek to characterize the entire national energy system are usually just single node in order to basically try and get that complexity down. And then looking at technologies, basically, why not just examine genuine options that you have rather than trying to dump every technology under the sun into a system? Because again, one of the problems then is that solutions might be dominated by technologies where you have low certainty in the numbers that you're putting in, rather than it actually being a correct balance between different options. Obviously, another problem here is that as soon as you want to apply stochastic methods, this makes things extremely complex to do. So again, scenario reduction and good application of uncertainty analysis becomes very important. We can also soft link models. We don't have to answer everything in one place. So with each piece of modeling, we can consider what should be treated as exogenous outside the model and what are inside it. So we can start linking models together. In a traditional power system world, we might be looking at a generation investment model that is separate from an adequacy model, so we can see how a particular pattern of investment then relates to actual system security and resilience, rather than trying to do everything in one single model, and perhaps a separate economic model that tells us what the available investment is. And similarly, we might want to expand out that we don't necessarily have to look at all parts of the energy system together in one place. If we're looking at energy service demands, perhaps we have building thermal models in the heat space that are separate to the actual electricity system and gas system models. So we can essentially do fairly simple modeling at one level and then validate the results in more complex sectoral specific models rather than having to do everything together. And there are various types of modeling that are appropriate to different phenomena that we see on the system. So again, these are the different types of analyses that we might be interested in, and we perhaps only worry about some of these in very specific sectoral models, whereas other parts we might be interested in looking at a high level. So perhaps if you're looking at a multi-energy model or multi-vector system, you concentrate on the lower temporal resolutions and then validate results in more detailed models that concentrate in the very specific physics of their own sectors. So in terms of thinking about what this might mean and how we go forward in multi-energy system modeling, I've put together previously some thoughts on this topic. It's always useful to think about what's the contribution of your model going to be, not just coming up with the most complex and sophisticated model that you can just for the purpose of it, even though it's always fun to try and do that, but try and think, what are we actually providing evidence towards? Who's going to use this? And this is a kind of list of things that a model might be able to do. So essentially, whether we actually just look at the concept of something, perhaps the specific numbers don't matter too much, but we're just showing that there is the potential for something to happen, as opposed to quantification. So perhaps then we look at what it delivers in terms of environmental improvements, cost, resilience, security, whatever. Or perhaps we're looking at embedding a certain technology within an existing system and we're looking at the detail of how that might occur, or we're just reducing the uncertainty of previous analyses. So these are all different things that we might try and get out of a model that we're using. But we also need to consider who we're trying to represent. And the vast majority of modeling is in the space of techno-economic optimization. So we're always trying to look at meeting perhaps an emissions reduction at the lowest cost. But we have to ask whether we're actually representing something that can really be a decision. So a lot of these models almost assume that there is a benevolent dictator somewhere who can make a decision and say, this is now what will happen because it appears to be the cheapest way to do something. And that person doesn't exist within deregulated markets. We have a regulator. There's been discussion around ideas of what a system architect could be and what that might look at. But at the moment, anything we need to produce, we need to deliver through deregulated market mechanisms. So coming out with outputs from a model that say this is the way forward, this is what we must do starting tomorrow, is not necessarily hugely useful to anybody. It demonstrates potentials, but it doesn't actually give a clear way forward. So I think this is an important consideration when we're doing multi-energy modeling, that we have outputs that are designed to be usable by someone in the system, that we can actually influence policy in some way. And I think, as I've said before, I think one of the problems that we often come across in this space is that there is perhaps a useful way to proceed through the modeling process, that where we should start with the problem definition and the context within which we're trying to build a model before we get on to framework selection, generating scenarios, collecting data. But many modelers start actually with a model before they know what the question is. Perhaps the department you work in has a nice model that's been developing for years that you want to carry on using, or you've got in your own mind for your academic interest a particular model that you want to use, or perhaps you even start here and there's a model that's already populated, parameterized, and you kind of have to use it. So I see that a lot of the time there's hammers looking for nails in this kind of space, which is a reflection of the fact that these models are complex, hard to build, and take time. It's difficult to build a new model from scratch every single time. But I think that often, if we go through this gradual process of correctly defining the problem, we find that actually we don't need these incredibly complex models to understand the problem that we're looking at. And this also comes onto the issue of what's exogenous to a model. What do we include inside the scope of a model and what do we have outside it? And this can be an issue because, generally speaking, if we're doing an electricity system model, we would have a demand for electricity as an exogenous input to that model. And this is some results from a paper we did this year looking at, again, heat pumps. So the value case for heat pumps, what the marginal abatement cost of heat pumps would be compared to other technologies in the UK. And for this case, this is comparing the marginal abatement cost of using electrical air source heat pumps against resistive electrical heating, against different household demands. So over on the left-hand side here are households with very low heat demand, where the cost benefit of replacing the electrical resistive heating with heat pumps is not worthwhile. So you have to put a lot of money in to actually get very little carbon benefit overall. So this is the actual range of heat demands for small households in the UK with electric storage heaters. So they're all kind of in this space. The cost benefit is not immediately apparent. You're going to get very expensive carbon reduction, as compared to natural gas homes that are in more this kind of space. So if these households were using electrical storage heaters, then they would be a good case for switching to heat pumps. However, that takes a view that this demand is exogenous. And we can see that these are both small households. And actually, what may be going on here is that simply these homes are underheated. And that if we gave these homes access to lower cost heating, such as through heat pumps, that demand would suddenly shift to the right and be more equivalent to this. So a view that looks at demand for demand for electricity for heating on its own gives us a very different view to where we actually look at heat as an energy service demand, where we get a picture of actually there's a strong rebound effect here. People would use more energy for heat if they had a lower cost of doing so. And this changes us to an area where actually we can start getting negative carbon abatement costs. So we both give people cheaper overall heating bills at the same time as reducing their carbon emissions. And this is something that would be entirely disguised if we treated the energy demand as completely exogenous. So I'll just finish up with a few kind of closing thoughts on good practice. And what we need to do is multiple energy modelers. And we still often work in silos. Let's say I'm in an electrical engineering department. There isn't a whole system department for me to sit in. Other people in whole edge analysis sit in other departments. For example, chemical processing or even economics departments. And we need to try and avoid these silos as much as possible, and especially getting out of just engineering and understanding some of the social science implications of what we're looking at. And fortunately, I work in UK Energy Research Centre. We're quite good for this, so there's a lot of interdisciplinary research where we get a good picture of what some of the impacts and behavioural changes might be that might interact with these systems. But fundamentally, the engineering is important. We need to make sure that the energy system actually works. All of these systems that we're looking at are large and complex, have a lot of detail. And we need to be careful that we don't come out with essentially preposterous conclusions that basically can't work. And I'm sure you see this when you look at the results of modelling that's from outside your sector that's talking about your own. But again, the engineering system is part of a wider social system. Heat pumps might be the answer, but the majority of people don't even know what a heat pump is. We need to be aware as well that we're working in the academic space, and we can be concerned with finding new methods and ways of doing things rather than specific results. And we are demonstrating that methods can be applied, but that doesn't really give any great conclusion or meaning to policymakers. And this is an issue nowadays because governments and utilities have a much smaller amount of their own research going on than they used to. They're very dependent on academic research to get insight into these issues. And there's more, I mean, that's good for us. It's more and more money and funding coming into our space, but we need to be careful that the work that we're doing gives good, grounded, concrete results that they can actually use. And I think that there is a strong need to update university teaching around this, again, because of that compartmentalization, people working in different silos. We don't have many courses currently in this country that are teaching whole systems as a modeling concept. So for actual model design, I think I've said that we need to be clear on choice of modeling framework and objective. Data is a huge issue. I mean, when we get into these spaces of multiple sectors, you start to have to curate and manage data sets that become very large, very hard to get hold of. If you're talking about networks, getting data from network companies can be very difficult. It goes out of date very quickly, and your results could be wrong because some change in the system that you weren't aware of. So I think it's as important that if you're trying to build a complex model, that you have a good system for refreshing the inputs to that model and auditing all the data that you're trying to use. And documentation and maintenance, so all the kind of things you might get in good software practice all apply here too. Share good practice as much as possible. If you're not a member of the open modeling communities or open mod, I would recommend signing up to that because there's a lot of good practice going on there, data sharing and discussion. And again, look to existing processes. What quality assurance should there be, and what external validation might you need? And a good way to think about this is to consider what would happen if your model gave wrong results. What are the impacts going to be of the results that you're giving out? If it's going to government or to a utility, that could potentially be huge. So you need to consider, what if I'm wrong? What's it going to mean to people out there, and hence to interpret your models correctly? And I think one thing that is perhaps happening far too much is the kind of not invented here tendency. So the idea that when you come to examine a modeling problem, you have a tendency to prefer solutions, models that were developed where you're actually working. So there's a lot of different research groups around the country that are all producing their own multi-vector system representations of the UK, simply because they want to have their own version of it. It's very tempting, particularly if you're a PhD student, to want to begin from the scratch building your own representation of the system. And we have, tens of different research groups around the country all asking off-gem network companies, BAYs, for the same data sets to go and make their own versions of models. And we end up with essentially lots and lots of different versions of the same modeling that we're all trying to do, where collaboration would perhaps be more beneficial, just because people don't like using models that weren't invented by the department that they work in. So again, I like working as part of UKERC because we have a lot of different modelers talking to each other and sharing models as much as possible. And I would encourage you to do similar. So on that basis, I'll just finish by selling one element of UKERC, which is our energy data center. And this is basically meant to be part of the solution to this problem, particularly around the fact that academic and industry projects often have a limited time span and data goes missing. So this is a central repository that's meant to exist indefinitely, separate to any particular academic research project, where when projects end, they can dump all their data, all their reports, all their outputs, and that this includes data sets from across public, private, third sector. And I would strongly suggest that if you're doing research in this space, you also consider using it as a repository. They can act as a DOI mint to link your data sets into publications as well. So I'll finish there. I'll put this picture up because I think a lot of the problems that we look at seem very complex, but actually some of the solutions are relatively simple. And this vanishing part of our energy system, the traditional insulation-clad hot water tank, is actually a very simple multi-vector system. It uses outputs from multiple technologies. It gives us a huge amounts of flexibility and capability to deal with flexing of demand. And perhaps if we just had a lot more of these in the system, then a huge amount of problems that we're trying to look at would go away again. And we don't necessarily need huge, complex temporal, spatial modeling to try and tell us that, in fact, we have something staring us in the face already. So I'll stop there. I think I've left a little bit of time for questions. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Graeme. That was extremely interesting. I'm a big fan of making models as simple as I can possibly get away with. So that's it's good to see. Okay, does anyone have any questions? If you put it in the chat or raise your hand.
Stunned silence.
Yeah, well, I thought I was trying to be clever by putting the attendee list and the chat popped out, but then it's just attached them both to Zoom. No, I've got them.
Hi, it's Neil here. Can I ask a question, please?
I suppose so, even though you've not put your hand up.
Well, you said you could unmute, didn't you? Or did you say put your hand up? Anyway,
So put your hand up. Go on.
I'll just blow the protocol. I'm using my insulation at the minute rather than turning my heating on. Yeah, I was interested in the hydrogen project that's taking place in, is it in Fife that it's going to be?
Yeah, that's a leaving math.
Yeah, it's just a sort of general question about that. Are you involved in that? And is there anything you can sort of share about that project? Seems like quite a dramatic, significant project. Is that right? Do you think could have a big effect?
Okay, so I'm not personally involved in that project.
Okay.
Been following it a little bit. So as David said, I spent a bit of time last year at the Scottish Government where we were certainly trying to get some of these projects going and helping towards them getting their network innovation funding.
Right.
I think there's good and bad sides to it. So it gives the first kind of clear route to a whole system bit of hydrogen. So it's connecting together renewable production all the way through to people's homes and heating, which as a demonstrator, I think has huge capability. I'm slightly concerned, though, that it's creating a new system in parallel. And there are various reasons for that. So essentially, they can't go in and tell people that they must now use hydrogen in their homes. Instead, they have to give the consumer choice as to whether to opt into this project or not. So unfortunately, that is just a constraint on the system. But it does mean that they're not converting existing network, which I think is also an important part of that evidence base. So I think one of the interesting things about that is this issue of, should we be supplying people with particular forms of energy? So in this case, we are treating methane and hydrogen as separate energy systems that people can choose from. Do we need to do that? Can we not just say people buy gas, which is what they do anyway? People have a gas bill. Back when we had town gas that had hydrogen, etc. in it, we didn't, try and sell them a complex billing framework based on the chemistry of what was coming into their homes. So I'm slightly concerned that perhaps we just need to get away from the idea that hydrogen is what we are selling to people, and that consumers should be getting either gas or just the energy service. And I think that's the kind of bit of that project that's missing. But fundamentally, as a demonstrator of wind power through to end heating, I think it's going to be incredibly useful.
Yeah, thank you.
It's a question from Laura in the chat, but I can see Laura has also activated her camera. So I don't know what that hand symbol means.
Her hand's disappeared. I'm trying to wave, but
oh, you're trying to wave. Okay.
Morphed into your background.
Would you like to ask your question, Laura?
Yeah, you mentioned we don't have a whole energy systems department for our whole energy systems people to sit within. So you end up with very siloed approaches. I find that's a big problem with SESI, and it's particularly when we're trying to find a journal of high enough caliber for people to want to publish in it. That's actually a multidisciplinary whole energy systems one is extremely difficult. So my question to you is, when you're in charge, Graeme, Keith's got to retire at some point, and you can take over. What would you see as the ideal setup for how to sort out that problem? Or I guess you've suggested UKERC has got ways round about it, for example.
It's difficult. I'm not sure that necessarily specifically having whole systems departments is the way forward. I think from a teaching perspective, I think it would be very useful if we did have perhaps postgraduate degrees that people could study that were more clearly teaching people about multiple systems. So I think at the moment we have it that people do an electrical engineering degree and then perhaps learn a bit about hydrogen afterwards, or someone understands gas and chemistry and then has to learn about the electricity system afterwards. So I think that would be the useful point to have, is to have departments that are teaching these kind of combined systems. I'm not necessarily sure that on a research basis, we definitely have to stand apart and alone as separate from everything else, because we should have individual expertises to bring to solving the problem. But I think you're right, how we actually get all that together is complex, but hopefully that's where groups like UKERC and SESI bring benefits. And I think the research that's coming out of these groups, where we are forced perhaps to get out of our silos, helps us to do that quite strongly. And I would ask you that, do you think SESI has been successful in getting people out of silos?
I would say yes when it comes to research collaboration, but no when it comes to publications. People are doing the research in a multidisciplinary way, but then trying to extract all their own disciplinary work so that they can get it into a decent journal.
Yeah, I think that is a problem. That of course the decent journals are still the silo-specific ones. You want your high impact factor publications that are going to be specific to your own current area of research, and the journals that you look at to perhaps do more combined research tend to at the moment be low impact factor. But I think that's only a matter of time, and the impact factor of those journals seems to be increasing pretty rapidly.
So Neil's asked a follow-up question to this, which is, how do academics deal with the problems of doing modelling to get published rather than to produce useful results for the energy transition? I expect you to answer that entirely.
There's a comment if you want.
I think that in my experience, actually, we don't have too much of a problem there at the moment, because as compared to other areas of research where you kind of feel like you have to be doing something entirely novel in order to get published, actually there does seem to be a lot of latitude in journals to not do anything methodologically new, but just to demonstrate a new application of it.
Yeah, this is something actually that I've run into as an issue, and have had some arguments with some of my colleagues. And I think it comes down to something that you put in one of your slides, which was they started at a different point in the model development process to where I would have started. So I would be more like what you suggested and start with what is the question I want to answer, whereas they would more started with what is the method I want to use. And that leads to something that is maybe more conventionally scientifically publishable because it's got more methodological novelty, but I would potentially struggle to see what the point of it was.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think social scientists in particular suffer from this, that they have great difficulty getting published if they're not doing something fundamentally novel, even if the outcomes of the project are very, very interesting. If they're not saying something clever about the fundamental knowledge frameworks they use, then they just get rejected. So I think that is a challenge, but then doing the kind of interdisciplinary work is another way of getting novel applications out into papers.
Okay, I've got a couple more questions more specifically about your model. So Kunpeng would like to know how your team validates your models, and Gary Howarth would like to know on your large models, what kind of runtimes are you seeing?
I mean, validation is going to be very specific to whichever model you're using. So again, it would just depend. So for example, in the heat modeling work, where we had to try and synthesize energy service demands, then we would validate that against off-gem statistics just to show that we were giving correct measures of what actual domestic demand is. And there's some fairly good data out there to try and do that with. But again, yeah, it's hard to give a general answer to that. It would just be whatever the scope of the specific model is. But I do think that is an issue. I don't think that is universally done, and particularly when you're trying to derive demands, that just doing that kind of sanity check on is this a realistic representation of demand as we currently see it isn't always happening. Yeah,
I think it can be very difficult, particularly if you're modeling something that doesn't really exist yet, which you and we would be in a lot of these kind of situations.
And I think that there's also the issue that we can get focused in on tiny bits of detail for incredibly unknown aspects of the system. So costs, for example, in the hydrogen space, you see big studies that give very detailed conclusions, but assume a price for electrolysis in 2050 that could be an order of magnitude out. So you need to take that into account when you're interpreting the results.
So you recommend doing some kind of sensitivity analysis or something?
Yeah,
like that.
Yeah, scenario or sensitivity analysis, again, trying to deal with the problem without making, again, huge dimensional problems.
Yeah, and that's great as well, because you can say, well, I don't know what the answer to this is, but I can see how it affects my model. We've got another question, which is, what's the optimal scale for implementing a multi-vector system, districts, regions, etc., and is the Energy Hub model representative in terms of scale?
So the Energy Hub model is useful because it doesn't have a specific set scale. It was developed as a framework for small, compact systems, I think, in Switzerland. So kind of looking at district heating, conversion systems that could use biomass reactors and that kind of thing. But the point is that you can use the Energy Hub formulation to do any scale you want. You can make a national representation. You can anything that you can represent as a set of nodes, you can use an Energy Hub formulation to do. But as in the optimal scale for implementing, again, that depends on which bit you're looking at. But I think a lot of the current interest is in regional and district models. Again, because of this question of whether we're electrifying or decarbonizing gases, particularly in the hydrogen transition, because we can't easily transition the transmission network, but we can transition the distribution network for gas. So we may be looking at a future in the UK where we have very disparate regional energy systems in a way we haven't had in the past, and understanding how we can perhaps develop. In Scotland, it would be the Aberdeen area. In England, it's the kind of Leeds and extending into the northeast. How those scale of systems might develop, rather than just trying to take an entirely national picture or just a neighbourhood picture.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions, which maybe you can answer in a quick fire style. So this one is, what kind of models do you generally develop? Are they like optimization type models, or are they simulation brackets agent-based models?
Personally, I mainly do optimization models, but try and avoid just making them always economic optimization models. So a lot of the modeling I use is least emissions modeling rather than least cost modeling, or some kind of multi-criteria objective to try and not just be in these kind of penny switching model areas. But within UKERC, there's a lot of different models and modeling capabilities. We do have agent-based modelers who are trying to look at, for example, how different system actors will respond to different market designs. So this is trying to address that problem I was talking about, of trying to make sure that the outputs are something that can actually be enacted by policymakers. What's the market design that's going to support a particular evolution of the system?
Okay, and the other question is whether this research contains any kind of controllability over the heat pumps that you've included. This person's working on DSR with flexibility from heat pumps, and would that help to mitigate the issue of the peak demand?
Yes, so the work that we did in the paper I mentioned a couple of times with UCL, that was combining national scale heat modeling with local scale heat modeling, we were looking specifically at how local network constraints can be overcome through that controllability of heat pumps. So how much controllability would you want to avoid LV network investment? And also, I didn't show anything about it today, but also looking at thermal storage and how that assists in that capability, and getting as much load onto heat pumps as opposed to gas systems as well. So yeah, and then that feeds back into the high level ideas I was talking about at the start, how we achieve system-wide flexibility when we have system-wide imbalances that aren't just about the network. So yeah, absolutely, these things are essential to mitigating peak demand.
Okay, all right. Well, it's now 12 o'clock, so there aren't any more questions. So well done, excellent work. So yeah, thank you, Graeme, for that. That was a really good presentation and some good question answering. Thank you everyone who's attended this this session, and people who've attended the past ones who I can't really thank if they're not here. And thanks to anyone who's watching this on YouTube when it's there. Yeah, so if you wouldn't mind taking the time to fill in our feedback form when Matt circulates it, and also if you have ideas in the future for either a talk like this or some kind of other event, if you'd like, that we can host through this interest group and platform, that would be really great, and that will be included in the form that Matt's going to circulate as well. Right, so yeah, thank you very much, everyone.
Okay, thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Graeme. It's really interesting.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.